And we're back. Another episode of Angular Unfiltered. We talk about all things Angular and all the things in between from in the Angular ecosystem, and talk about questions. I take questions from the community. Um, back again. Have another great guest with me today. Most of you most likely know who he is already. But Minko, go ahead and introduce yourself for the people who, for some reason, may not know, haven't seen your face already.
Sure. Yeah, my name is Minko. I'm working on Angular. Before joining the team for about 5 years, I have been contributing to the framework in different ways, submitting pull requests, organizing meetups, creating tools, writing articles, stuff like that. So I've been part of the Angular ecosystem for a while now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you're one of a few people that has run the entire circle of the of the Angular ecosystem. I think probably you and Rob and probably Steven, people who went from community contributors to writing blog posts about Angular, and then ended up going to Google. At least a few people that I know of that ended up joining Google as an official thing, transitioning in that way. So yeah, I think that's pretty cool.
I was going to say that I actually met Steven for the first time on NG Vegas. That was a conference that the NGConf organizers were running, actually only for 1 year, I think. I'm not sure whether we met, but we both gave talks there. That's what I later realized. That's where I also met Matthias and Jeff as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. So how long have you been on the Angular team at Google now? Has it been over a year? Has it been? I can't remember how long it's been.
Yeah, it's going to be 2 years in about 25 days.
Okay, cool. Congrats.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's the time passes quickly.
Yeah.
Well, with the pandemic nowadays, I feel like it's dragging.
Yeah, time is passing a little more slowly these days in a pandemic because we're all at home and everything. But yeah, so you've been, I guess you transitioned to DevRel at Google. So what kind of things have changed since you moved over to working for Google? Because I know you said, you did a lot of contributions before, but has your role as developer advocate changed since you've been there, or how's that been?
So yeah, there were quite a few changes. Actually, the role is changing as well.
Okay.
I was originally, I enjoy the engineering portion. I enjoy the community portion as well. That's what I was doing in my spare time previously, organizing meetups, for example, meeting folks and flying for conferences. And the engineering portion was very important as well. So originally, when I was talking to Brad and to Alex Ego to join the team, I was strongly considering a role which was somewhere in between developer advocate and between engineer, which was developer programs engineer back then. With Rob, we're actually we had the same role. Later on, actually, this is something that later on I realized that the difference between developer advocate and developer programs engineer is pretty much insignificant.
Okay.
So we're all writing code, and we're all talking to folks, advocating for developers, and flying around for conferences and working on content. So what changed primarily was that I was shipping a lot of code in my spare time. I was shipping library pretty much every other week, creating some tools which eventually, when I was getting bored, I was abandoning them because.
So you were finding. Well, I don't want to say you were finding stuff to do, but you seem to be pretty proficient at cranking out things in general, just from libraries like Codalyzer and other things like that. So
yeah,
you were just kind of filling in those gaps there.
Yeah, there were some things that I wasn't able to deprecate. Codalyzer got some traction. So at a certain point, it got adoption by the Angular CLI, and I kept maintaining it. But there were some other libraries which I built. I saw that people are not using them too heavily, so I was able to just stop working on them. When I joined the team, and also I was making some pretty big changes in my tooling, and like nobody really was able to notice that because like there were I guess like 100 people using them or so, and
you're just throwing breaking changes around, and nobody's like, "Hey, what are you doing?" They're just rolling with it, huh?
Yeah, pretty much. With some exceptions, like Colorizer, for example, had pretty decent test coverage, and a few other tools. When I joined the team, I had the same mindset the first month. I didn't realize how what's the usage of Angular. I knew the numbers because I see the number of let's say visits on Angular IO or the number of downloads on npm and stuff like that. But in general, it's like one to see the number and the other to deal with the pain of migration, let's say. So I was very passionate on making ng modules optional as well, since everyone.
I remember that PR that came through. I don't think that was like pretty soon after you joined the team. You were like coming right out the gate, like, let's get these ng modules. Let's get these ng modules part of the way out of here at the time.
Exactly, yeah. And well, I opened this PR, and it was kind of well accepted. But at the same time, we started discussions in the team what the implications of this pull request could be, whether there are better solutions, because this was about 500 lines of code change in the compiler, the JIT compiler, and the ahead of time compiler and the runtime. So it wasn't a huge change. But at the same time, the impact on the public API surface was going to be dramatic. What I ended up doing is I created a document where I just compare different approaches that different frameworks have, and also that we can implement in Angular. I figured out that the original approach I took is probably not the best one, and also this can have a lot of impact on the ecosystem. So I generally closed the PR down, and since then we have been designing this. So it turned out to be a complicated project.
Yeah, I'd imagine so. I remember even when ng modules were introduced, I'm pretty sure they weren't just thrown in and they went through like a formal design process and everything. And I guess you're kind of doing the reverse of that now. Where you're trying to design the process of not making them go away, but making them go away or making them not necessary anymore, so that people will kind of naturally migrate away from them at some point.
Yeah. Actually, I have even a personal story with ng modules. So
okay.
when I published the first edition of my book, Getting Started with Angular 2, back then there was the 2 at the end. I released it. We published it as aligned with RFC 4. And RFC 5 came out a couple of weeks after that, and it introduced ng modules, and my book got out of date. And now we're getting to a stage when eventually we might be able to get my book up to date again.
So you're just gonna dust off the book, and this is gonna be right back where it was before ng modules, or there's probably an excerpt in there that ng modules were a thing, but they're not a thing anymore.
Yeah. Let's see how we land this change.
Yeah, I'm sure there are still some people who will shout for joy. I know Lars, he says it's been almost 2 years. He's still waiting on the ng modules tombstone. That'll be happy when there at least is some design doc or something further that shows ng modules kind of going on the other side of the Angular ecosystem, I guess.
Yeah, probably since this is a large change, and although we have been thinking about this probably for at least 2 years for sure, because since I joined the team, there were people thinking about this already. Although we have been thinking about this for a long time now, whenever we decide to go ahead and make them optional, there is going to be a public discussion happening around that, because we would want to hear concerns of library authors as well, and see how we can go from there. Yeah,
because I would fair to say that like ng modules are pretty much like the public API for how you develop Angular libraries at this point. I mean, you pretty much have to have them unless you're doing some standalone services or something like that. But yeah. Yeah, so I think that kind of is a good lead into what we were wanted to talk about specifically here is the RFC process that Angular has recently introduced. And I think, like I said, you talked about developing or putting it together a design doc on how you can make ng module optional in Angular, and I would imagine that would be something that could come through an RFC, as you guys have like recently introduced that. So I believe you've published a few RFCs already, and that's been part of a long process. Like how's the process gone so far, and what prompted the change of bringing back the RFCs? I know they existed at some point in time before, when they were more of a public thing that the team did.
Yeah, So that was a proposal of Jules to get the RFCs back. It generally it makes sense. It's a common practice across open source projects. It's just a good engineering practice and community practice as well, I would say, in at least a couple of ways. First, although we are thinking a lot about Angular all day long, we would not be able to come up with all the answers. So getting folks into the discussion, that's great for the engineering decision as well. And also it's really informative. We can inform and include people in the design process. So that's important for any major open source projects with a community around it. The problem with the RFCs that I see, so it's not a problem, it's just like RFCs are not great for anything. There are some things which are better designed with another approach. For the RFCs, there is this bias from folks who are for advanced developers, because most people who are just getting started with web development or with Angular, they wouldn't be looking at the Angular issue tracker. They wouldn't be
they might not even be familiar with what an RFC is, right?
Yeah.
Or maybe something that is intimidating to someone who's new to web development, or because they're pretty, at least from the ones that I read, all of them are usually pretty lengthy and pretty in depth about what the problem is, what they're trying to solve.
Yeah, especially if you have looked at the RFC for Ivy library distribution. It goes pretty much in depth about compilers and our compilation pipeline and how we want to introduce this intermediate format. And someone who just wants to build a small application with Angular doesn't really need to think about it. So we are finding, so the RFC is not a great fit for anything. For example, the strict features that we want to slowly land in Angular, we want to make the default settings in Angular just stricter so that we can perform more optimizations, to perform easier ng updates, and to help folks get better development experiences. Type checking helps with that and helps with fewer issues at the end. This seemed like we actually considered that as an RFC as well, and this seemed like not the perfect fit for one. So all the Angular developers who are following closely the Angular issue tracker, they will be excited about type checking, since we all understand the benefits of that. But at the same time, we wouldn't be able to include folks who are just getting started with the framework, and these type checking errors are just going to be overwhelming because they will be between them and a running application.
Yeah, see. So I guess just as far as, if I'm hearing you right, you're saying that you've gone through a few of these RFCs, and just the process of just putting them out there and having people comment isn't necessarily the best way to collaborate on getting those technical issues solved.
Yeah, that's the very, very, very first version of the RFC process. We would want to, so currently there are just issues. Eventually we're thinking of having either a separate repo or submitting pull requests to the repository with markdown files with the individual RFC, so that we can keep track of the history there, the change history as well.
So you mentioned they're using other open source projects. Does that kind of line up with how other projects implement RFCs, or is it kind of slightly different just based on the requirements of Angular in general?
It's that's a great question. Yeah, so before we implemented this process, we had long conversations with different other open source projects as well. I talked to friends of mine from Ember, Chris Garrett, who who gave me a lot of insights about the RFC process in Ember, and Ember reused some of the got some inspiration from Rust. Also talked to friends from Linux Foundation who used to work on Ubuntu in the past. So we had brainstorming sessions with them on how to approach. And generally, the recommendation was just to start small and from there grow depending on the opportunity, how we can do better in terms of communication of the issues and depending on what the community needs. So we are considering next steps moving to a more kind of persistent format where instead of having issues, we'll be having markdown files. And we talked a lot about community-initiated RFC since this is the ultimate goal. Currently, the concern with that is that we don't want to just collect RFCs and not be able to do anything about this and just have more issues in the issue tracker. So we're holding off this a little bit, especially given that we're dealing a lot with issue triage recently. We want to be able to get a hold of what we are doing before we fully commit to expanding the process.
Yeah, I know at least in other talks that I've seen, Jules and you and Steven have really focused on burning down like the bugs or kind of getting the health of the Angular project together. You said before you start bringing in new things, or like I said, even introducing new RFCs in that way.
Yeah. Yeah, we're going to run some more RFCs. We're planning to share a couple of more. But yeah, pretty much anything with large impact, not necessarily only public interface, not only public API necessarily, but also stuff like removal of render blocking resources, which was one of the RFCs that we run under the Angular CLI. All these seem like a good fit for an RFC to get some more folks working and thinking about the entire process and the entire implementation. And they're also great for communication on what are we thinking of doing, because there are a lot of people using Angular and a lot of people interested in Angular who wants to join the engineering process and build the framework together. Like pretty much when I was writing my book, most of what I learned for Angular was from design documents and reading through source code. So that's what we should revert back.
Okay. So let's see, there was a question here from Lars. Any news on when the Angular roadmap on Angular IO will be updated?
Yeah, we're updating. Oh, yeah, that's actually. So I have two things to share there. So we're planning to update it quarterly. We were thinking of how we can automate the process of, because we keep it internally with just like spreadsheets and like Trello cards, stuff like that. We're thinking of how we can generate it automatically, but at the same time, we can do that. It's not hard, but it requires some manual work since our projects have usually short names, since we're all day like thinking about Angular and working on Angular. But these short names are not very meaningful for people outside of the team, and we need to go through an iteration and update the name and update the description to add more context, which is not going to be easy to be automatically generated. Right.
So you mentioned, I guess some of the other things, at least if I remember correctly, like the Ivy library distribution one and the one for render blocking CSS, those were ones that weren't mentioned as part of the roadmap, if I remember correctly, right? So those were like additional things that you have been thinking about, like as a team, that weren't public until you open the RFC. So what's the difference in the things that were like mentioned specifically in the roadmap versus things that you're just kind of gonna put out there through the RFC process, or maybe not the structured RFC process, but the process that you determine is a good way to get ideas out there?
Yeah. Usually in the roadmap, we're trying to capture efforts which are bigger And removal of render blocking resources is a project that we can complete within, let's say, a week or two.
Okay.
Compared to DevTools, which is something that is going to take like months to roll out, or removal of View Engine. And the removal of View Engine is actually the parent project of the Ivy library distribution. So there is, I would say that we can definitely do better in this aspect as well to capture better the efforts that we're working on. And this is something that the leadership, like the management of the team, is also trying to do. And this is also going to help us communicate what we have been up to and working on more clearly. This is just our first iteration. My guess is we'll be able to capture things even more precisely in the future. Currently, they're just either smaller efforts or just parts of larger projects.
So the smaller efforts are things that, well, I guess they're kind of things that you don't necessarily have to commit to, but you can, like you said, you can do pretty quickly, so you don't have to go through as much of like the formal process of things that are on the roadmap, because you said those things are going to take a longer amount of time.
The render blocking resource is an interesting one. So every week we talk to the Chrome team, because like we're pretty much thinking on how we can make web applications built with frameworks faster. It's not necessarily even only focused on Angular. We're also discussing other frameworks as well, and brainstorming solutions which are applicable for the different technologies. And the idea for removal of render blocking resources was actually born during one such discussion. The Chrome team, they said, "Oh, do you know that we have this awesome plugin called Critters that allows you to just detect what is your current critical CSS for the page without running the application?" And we said, "Oh, this can work really well for removal of render blocking resources." So we ended up, and that's also critical for performance generally. So yeah, we ended up pushing it a little bit sooner.
Okay, yeah, I know recently that the Scully project, they added a feature to their, to their library platform that also only ships the critical CSS when they're building out or rendering out their pages when you're using Scully. So I would imagine they would be able to take some advantage of what you all are doing and not necessarily have to ship custom code for that, right? Or is that kind of a different thing?
They pre-render routes slightly differently. They use headless Chrome, and instead of using headless Chrome, Universal would be just statically analyzing the selectors, the CSS selectors, and matching them against the page. So that's going to be the difference. We had a discussion with them as well.
Okay. So at least back on the RFCs, you mentioned that you're still working on kind of like ironing out the process for people to submit RFCs, but the goal in general would be that the community could submit RFCs for a part of the framework that they would like to see something change with there, or maybe a new feature or something like that. Would that fit into this formal, I guess that would already fit, would that fit into this formal process that you're kind of ironing out for RFCs, or if there's another term for it?
Yeah, that's the ultimate goal. We hope that we're going to reach this. Currently, we're still working on the top issues that we have opened on Angular right now. So our only concern is to not get a lot of RFCs and not be able to address them and like spend enough time in order to evaluate them and work with people on resolving them. So that's why we're taking this slower. But yeah, that's definitely the ultimate goal.
Yeah, so I know there's a balance between like opening an RFC versus Angular being more of a platform that people build around and build on top of. Is that something that you kind of gauge into these decisions on what things to kind of build within the team itself versus maybe letting like the Angular community, the Angular ecosystem kind of take on those things?
Internationalization, I would say, is such a good example. and as a framework contributor, I was not too frequently opening pull requests to the framework. I was pretty much building on top of the framework by using private APIs of the router. I'm hoping one day we're going to have public APIs of the router. So this is something that we have been like slowly thinking about as well. But given that we have untyped reactive forms, this is something that we're spending like our main capacity on like thinking about. If you, so I wouldn't say that this is a top priority project at the moment. It is very important, but we want to address also some issues that have been up there for quite some time now, for 4 years even. We closed recently one allow translation strings to be outside of Angular templates to be in components.
Right. Yeah, I saw that one. Yeah.
Yeah, I got so excited when this happened. And
so
yeah.
So as far as like you mentioned the router and like using private APIs there, what are some of the APIs? You just mean APIs for like statically getting routes, or I'm just trying to think of what things could be exposed to make the router so that people could maybe extend the router more.
I meant compiler actually. Sorry.
Oh, compiler. Sorry. Okay.
Yeah.
I guess.
Okay. And the router is another example. For example, a lot of folks are saying that the Angular router is too big. Well, it comes with a lot of features. That's why it is too big. It is too big. But having options sometimes, like it's great. And this is actually the topic of another discussion. But we have been recommending, for example, the community internationalization solutions for people who don't want to depend on compile time solution. It has its own trade-offs, but as soon as we communicate well these trade-offs, people should be definitely building tool set for the framework. I would say this is the same for the router as well. I really like the router that you built. It is much smaller, and
well, yeah, it had I would say it had a different aim and goal in mind as far as what I wanted it to do with it, because I wanted it to be have less features. So like I said, you get the smaller bundles, and then you kind of get to pick and choose like how much of that you want to take on, and then we could slowly introduce more things over time.
I was looking at this, and if it my wish there was to not have hard dependency on RxJS and to be able to like lift the APIs to use observables if they have to. That's my secret feature request there.
Okay. I'm gonna have to note that. We got a live feature request. I'm gonna have to note that down. Or we can talk afterward, and we can dig into that one a little more, because I'm interested in what you have there, because I haven't touched the project in a while, but I'm definitely wanting to get back to it. I think we can start to wrap up there. I think we talked about RFCs, we talked about the community and where the community like fits into the process of RFCs, and how they can at least how can the community, I guess I will end on this, how can the community get involved in the process that exists today? Because you still are opening RFCs. Is it just commenting on the RFCs, kind of hashing out those things, or seeing what you guys' perspective or you all's perspective is? How can the community get help? How can we help you help us? I guess that's the question.
So every time when we open an RFC, we first try to share it as much as possible. We know the public channels, and the folks who have created the RFCs, they make sure they read through all the comments and also address them. And at the end of every RFC, we are submitting a short summary of what we learned and what are the next steps based on the discussion. Something that we have been doing, for which I would also want to ask for some feedback, was since when we were closing the RFCs 2 weeks after that, we're usually locking them, since when something is closed, we try not to read closed issues, because that just like extra stuff in our inbox, and it's harder to manage. If locking, so the locking part just wants to make sure that everyone is fine with this, and you don't see any way that it can kind of impact the further communication. That's why we have been doing it. But if you have feedback about this, feel free to reach out.
Okay. So yeah, I know how that feeling is, because I've been on that too, or I guess I'm still on that today, where like 4 years later, someone comments on an issue, there was still comments on a closed issue that is still out there. So I know how that goes. Is there anything you would like to plug before we wrap up?
Yeah, well, I guess we're planning version 11 for the 11th of November, so 11/11. So that's something exciting.
Okay, that was new. I did not know that. I did not know that. I don't know if that was if that had been announced publicly, but I didn't know it was that close.
Yeah, that's kind of information shared with like close friends, because so far we have this tendency to not hit the release dates that we're targeting. So let's see whether we're going to hit 11/11 today, like this time.
Okay. Well, I know I was kind of surprised when the next releases started showing up, because I guess it seemed like it was just a few weeks ago that 10 came out, but it's like I say, you got to keep it rolling there.
Yeah.
So yeah. On that note, thanks, Minko, for coming on and talking about the process. And like I said, I'm sure that the Angular community will be watching that closely going forward. And like I said, we look forward to seeing what things come out of that, or the things that y'all have learned about the RFC process itself and how that further matures in the future.
Sounds good. Yeah. Thank you for having me. It was a lot of fun chatting.
Yep. And thanks to everyone that coming out and hanging out in the chat. You can subscribe to the channel. I always appreciate the people that come and hang out and ask questions. And I think on that note, we'll see you next time. See ya.
Bye-bye.